It's obviously very late in the day and almost everything important has already been said. So I'm going to make this relatively short and talk a little bit about exactly how I approach philosophy and in the context of the kind of debates we've been having and what I think the contribution of philosophy to the understanding of the human condition might be. In particular, what should the focus of philosophy be? And one answer is that philosophy should focus on whatever it is that promises to make sense of things. But then what is making sense of things? That's a philosophical question. And I think it tends to go round and round in a circle. Whenever philosophers ask themselves what they're doing, that circle proposes itself and stays essentially stationary in the middle of their thought. But among the candidates that people have put forward, at least these. First of all, that philosophy should provide the ultimate explanation of things, the grounds for our knowledge, by giving an account of what the world contains. But why would that be a help to us? Why would it be a help to know, the ultimate constituents of reality? And what if there is no ground anyway? That is much more the modern view, that after all we have the methods for discovering truths, but not a method for discovering the ultimate truth on which all other truths depend. And this is, I think, the root of analytical philosophy as I understand it. It's not that it was proposed in that way, but it grew from this sense that maybe there is no ground, no ultimate ground of everything. Maybe all that we do have are our methods, and we should study those. Study the methods that we use to find out things on the basis of experience or rational thought, and try to understand what the limits of those methods are. And this wasn't really only analytical philosophy that proposed this. Of course, Kant was famous for doing this in a rather different language and a different way of thinking, but the critique of pure reason is just that. It's the attempt to show just how far we can get using reason alone, and to draw the limits. And as many of you know, this attempt to draw the limits to our knowledge immediately led to the attempt to go beyond them. Hegel in particular said, how can you draw a limit if there isn't another side to it? So you've already shown, as it were, or opened the way to transcending those limits, and which is something that he was very good at. By virtue of his dialectical method. But what Kant was talking about was actually the idea that our world might be contained within a one-sided boundary. Physicists have since taken this on board. There can be such things as one-sided boundaries, and maybe philosophy has the exploration of such a boundary as its goal. Well, that's just a thought. However, my generation saw things a little bit differently, and I'm different from most people in this room. I think I'm older than most people in this room, all people in this room, I suspect. Murray is the only candidate to match me, I think. But my generation grew to immaturity in the 60s, and at that time, various things were on offer to us by way of a focus for philosophy. One was the old way of making sense that through religion and all its mysteries. And religion still existed as a very powerful force. It still does, of course, in a different form. But the old inherited Christian religion was very much a part of my upbringing. And through religion and all its mysteries, which were woven into the texture of society, there was a sense that there is a meaning, and it's been revealed. But those threads through which religion was woven into things, the Christian religion rather, have been coming apart. And in the 1960s, as I say, which was my generation, a new way of making sense proposed itself through politics, through radical action, through the overthrow of the surrounding order, what Badiou calls the event. And around this idea, an extraordinary mystery was woven in turn. And that mystery invaded the academy and remains there in many forms. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But there was so religion and politics contended for a while, but I was brought up in Cambridge, which resolutely espoused a third way, the way of renunciation, if you like, that philosophy was not to be a handmaiden of politics. It was not to be the handmaiden of theology, as it had been in the Middle Ages. It was to be a descriptive science. And we were introduced to this idea by Peter Strawson, who was then professor of metaphysics in Oxford, the idea that there should be such a thing as a descriptive metaphysics. We can't, through thinking alone, transcend our own natural understanding of things, but we can explore the presuppositions contained in that natural understanding. We explore our concepts and our ways of thought to discover exactly what it is that we suppose the world to be, not just in our speculations, but in our language itself. Our language already presents an ontology, and the best thing philosophy can do is to lay that thing bare, and then we contemplate it and discover that it is indeed just as boring as we feared. But this descriptive metaphysics involved also a kind of retreat before the ever more expanding claims of science. The scientific worldview was the thing to which people turned by way of understanding just what the world contains, and that that was the first step towards the renunciation of what you might think of as the humane calling of the philosopher. A philosopher was then retreating already in my youth from this idea that it was a proper humanity, and retreating back to what Locke had called it, which is the handmaiden of the sciences. He was effectively saying it's not theology that philosophy should be helping, but science. Well, the political project, of course, was a very radical one, and probably would take us too far away from the concerns of this gathering to go into it in any depth. But of course it took off in France in a big way, as we know, partly also in Germany, but in France it was associated with the revolutionary movement of the 1960s and a kind of new mysticism. In particular, the Maoist idea that society is founded upon and moves through contradictions. That became very, very important. And of course, it's a very convenient thing to believe that the human world is founded on contradictions and moves through contradictions, because it doesn't then matter if you're uttering any of that yourself. Obviously, the analytical tradition in Oxford and Cambridge was very contemptuous of this. The whole idea that things that people should be allowed to think in terms of contradictions. All that philosophy could do for them was to point out contradictions and show that you can't go that way. Anyway, we all know that a completely different language arose in France, and to some extent Italy and Germany at that time. I think Tao was saying that he'd come across an article by Derek Parfit saying that that the continental philosophers produced these incredibly interesting questions, but murky and in effect unintelligible answers, whereas the analytical philosophers produced these wonderful lucid answers to completely pointless questions. And I think there's great truth in that. and it's a very accurate description of Derek Parfit. Well, perhaps we shouldn't go into that. But here is just one example. I mean, most of you have probably come across Deleuze. I won't read to you anything from Deleuze, but I'll just give you one sentence or two sentences from Zizek commenting upon Deleuze, so you know the style. Is, on the one hand, the productive flux of pure becoming not the body without organs, the body not yet structured or determined as functional organs? And, on the other hand, are the organs without a body not the virtuality of the pure affect extracted from its embeddedness in a body? There. Now, inevitably, confronting such a sentence, you would ask, let's get to the heart of this. What is a body without organs? Now, everybody knows that there is this thing. It's called BWO. The literature on it is enormous. It's an expression introduced by Deleuze and Guattari in L'Anti-Oedipe, which and then taken up again in Mille Plateaux. And nobody has ever been able to explain it more clearly than that. That is the clearest explanation I've come across of this thing. But it's put in the form of, on the one hand, is it this? Or on the other hand, is it that? And yet both hands are unintelligible. But I'm not saying this is all nonsense, because these are very clever people and they have something they're trying to say. But it's not something that I could really elucidate. And the question it poses to me is, should I go along that line and really try and get into understanding what the body without organs is and how to make it apparent, its meaning apparent to the ordinary humanity, or should I go on practicing the thing that I was taught to do, which is analytical philosophy? This has been a dilemma for me from the very beginning, because I do recognize that analytical philosophy is fairly sterile in results in the areas that interest me. But not only that, it also does have a deadening effect on the idea and the aspiration of a humane education. So I want to say, just take up the rest of this little talk with reflecting on that. Because of the way in which analytical philosophy has aligned itself with the sciences, it has inevitably conceded space to the sciences whenever it felt itself to be in conflict with them. We've seen this especially in the philosophy of mind recently. Despite these brave efforts by people like Tom Nagel to say that actually the human mind is not something that can be comprehended in the easy way that the neuroscientists claim, nevertheless, in any real deep encounter with a neuroscientist, the analytical philosopher will creep into a corner and nurse his wounds. There is no attempts really to create a philosophy of the human being and the human mind and of the relation between the human being and his world that will stand up to the invasions of the army of neuro-nerds. And there's just this attempt to hang on to the rags of humanity, but through phenomenology or through describing the human mind as the what it's like that's left over when the science has been done. You know, but that is not enough. That what it's like turns out to be indescribable anyway. So it's not surprising that in the light of this, we don't really have philosophers who can stand in the public eye, stand up as representatives of the cultivated view of things, presenting a serious vision of the human condition to the ordinary person. And we don't, I say we analytical philosophers, we don't have anybody to rival someone like Foucault or Deleuze. Now, but we would say Foucault is a different case, but Deleuze owes his reputation to the fact that no one understands him, Deleuze included. And you know, such people are incredibly lucky to be able to have found a totally unintelligible language and be able to speak it endlessly gives you an authority that nobody can match and nobody can undermine. So what have I been trying to do in all this? This brings me to the egotistical part of it, my journey. As I say, I grew up in a still Christian England. That's to say, it was an England in which, although only 10% of people attended church, all of them put C of E on their passports when asked for their religion. And as all Englishmen will know, the great virtue of the Anglican Church is that it doesn't require belief, specifically, not any doctrine or anything. It requires basic decency of behaviour and going quiet as you walk past a church where other people are praying. But it's a wonderful invention. It kept this country. I'm talking of England, not of Scotland. Sorry, but it kept our country, roughly speaking, within the constraints of the Ten Commandments, with a general public decency, in a sense that even if we don't know what anything means, if we ever got to the position where we had to know that, we'd know where to turn. But luckily enough, life is too busy to bother with that. But I, being a reflective sort of person, very quickly wondered how I could replace my lost religion with something else. And I turned to the idea of culture, as many people in my generation did in England, much influenced not by philosophy but by poetry, and in particular by T.S. Eliot, who of course was a Christian and an American, but was able to translate into the language of poetry in ways accessible to people who didn't accept the underlying metaphysics, the idea of the sacred, the idea of living in a sacred and consecrated place, which had inherited the forms of significance that are still available, and we had to search them out. And I think that resonated totally in me, and in many others of my generation, that we should be looking for forms of significance which had been, as it were, buried in the heart of things by our ancestors and were still available to us. This is amplified by reading things like T.S. Eliot's critical essays, which were devoted to people like Dante and Baudelaire, not the Germans particularly, but poets in another language, and giving us the sense that really you had to work to find meaning. And I think that came across in Harry's beautiful talk about Horace, and I'm sure it's part of what appealed to Harry in Horace, that you had to work to extract the meaning. And we just got this idea that there is meaning in things, and if you work hard enough and in the right way, you can extract it. But that science won't get you there. And that was a very important thought for me, because I was educated as a scientist up until going to university, and I recognised that what I was looking for in life was never going to be acquired through this discipline, much as I respected the discipline. And of course, culture presented itself as an alternative, and with culture, the whole idea and practice of art. And when I went to Cambridge, I read what was then called moral sciences, which, the two terms already are in conflict with each other. But it was taught in a very old-fashioned way, but essentially it amounted to the analysis of concepts and the analysis of thought. What I described earlier as describing the contours of the one-sided boundary in which we live, without any promise that you could get to the other side. And I think I stayed within analytical philosophy, learning the discipline. I don't despise it at all. I think it is full of results, interesting results, and genuine arguments. They really are valid arguments in philosophy. It's just that only a few of us understand what they are. But it doesn't help with this great question of meaning. But So I had to try and think about how I could approach the things that really mattered to me in a philosophical spirit without just going round and round in conceptual circles. And of course there were these other schools of philosophy. I didn't like the continental at first, but then I came to realize that there'd been a long-standing tradition in continental philosophy, independent of all the political stuff, although it got mixed up with it, in which there was an attempt to give a role to philosophy in understanding the human world. And in particular, I sort of took over from Husserl, the phenomenologist, the concept of the Lebenswelt, the world of life, the world in which we live. Now, and the thought being that you can understand this world in a different way, and you must understand it in a different way from the way in which science understands physical reality, although it is in some deep sense the same world. It's the same world, but organized in another way, organized as the thing in which we are and with which we interact. And this thought is a simple thought, but it comes in lots of different versions. Heidegger gives his version of it. Dilthey gave a sort of version early in the 19th century. It's there in Sartre, of course, and the existentialists, and so on. But because of my analytical training, I was always skeptical that you would get to understand this Lebenswelt, the world of life, through phenomenology, through looking intensely at the first-person case and trying to understand what is revealed to you in your inner life. Now, of course, not all phenomenologists do concentrate on the inner life, but Husserl did, and he thought that he had a method for deciphering it, for pulling apart the structural strands in it and so on, and getting from it the peculiar form of knowledge which comes through self-consciousness itself. Now, I don't go along with that, but nevertheless, I think that we can make use of this distinction between the world of physics or world of nature and the Lebenswelt, the world of life, and through philosophical concepts and begin to make sense of the idea that we understand the world in at least two ways, maybe a lot more than two, but that these ways are incommensurable. This is what I've tried to lay out in recent books, and I just summarize the sort of thing that I want to say. An example that I use, and I've used before, which I think is very instructive to artists, is the example of the ornamental marble. You sculptors, Mark will know about this. Ornamental marbles include, obviously, marble and porphyry, onyx, etc. There's many of them. But marble, as you know, is calcium carbonate. It's an allotrope of chalk. So from the chemical point of view, it's something totally different from porphyry, which is a silicate, like glass. And onyx is an oxide. This category completely crosses all the available scientific categories that could be used to explain the properties of these things. So it's a category which is totally useless from the point of view of the science of stones. The science which will explain exactly what the properties of these stones are will have to break this category apart and reject it. But for the artist, this category is a single thing. These things have to be brought together because they have a shared aesthetic function. That they can be set side by side in an inlay. They can be used to ornament things in complementary ways, and they have properties which are revealed in their appearance through their interaction with the light, which is in particular, it's that crystalline character which enables them to combine. And all the Byzantine architects knew this, and so did the Renaissance architects in Italy. In fact, all architects knew this until the modernists destroyed architecture. So there's an interesting example of something which which you can see replicated in lots of different ways, classifications that drop out of science. And some of these classifications are very close to us. In all the events that occur in this world, there are scientific theories governing them. They fall under universal laws, and the hope has been over the years that there will be eventually some kind of unified science that will bring them all together. But there are some events which we describe in a completely different way from the way that science would describe them. For instance, there are things for which you are responsible, things that have happened which I attribute to you or impute to you, as the lawyers say, because whether or not you did them, they lie within your sphere of responsibility. It's your fault that that person was run over by the lawnmower, etc. There's an interesting concept which, again, couldn't occur in the science of that event. It's creating a relation between you and something in the physical world, which you immediately understand, and you recognize you're answerable for that thing. If I hold you responsible, you're answerable. You have to account for it. And if you look at this in depth, you'll see that there's a vast range of concepts that we use to describe each other, which have their roots not in the physical reality, but in the kind of relations that we have to each other when we are engaged in dialogue. The idea of responsibility comes about because when you've done something, I can accuse you of it. And I accuse you by saying, you did it. I don't say, he did it. I say you, pointing to you, and you confess to it, saying, yes, I did it, but I did it because I had a jolly good reason. And anyway, who are you to accuse me? So there's this I to you dialogue which bypasses the physical reality and concerns entirely the give and take of reasons between people. So this feature that I've illustrated through the example of marbles actually reflects a much deeper fissure in the whole of our worldview between those categories that are applied in explaining things and those categories that are applied in understanding, justifying, excusing, answering, rendering each other accountable, and essentially establishing between us the relation that is necessary for us to be at home together. Now, thinking of that, I think this is enormously relevant to art and the aesthetic generally, and I'll just give a couple of examples. First, the example of architecture. Many people would say, especially scientifically minded people, that architecture is, of course, a very important part of human existence. It involves satisfying certain uses, certain functions that we all have, the need for shelter and warmth and protection and places where we can assemble and all the rest. You can give an account. You don't need to give an account because we all know this. And that's it. It's a means to an end, which we also have various optional choices to make when fulfilling it. And these choices are subjective in the sense that there's no objective matter, no objective reasoning that could justify one choice rather than another. As long as the function is fulfilled, then the architecture has done what has fulfilled any rational requirement. The rest is simply a matter of choice or taste. Now, I think I got thinking about aesthetics partly because of the example of architecture. When I saw my hometown being pulled apart and replaced with concrete blocks, I thought, there's something wrong here. This was a livable home and no longer is. But is that just a subjective judgment of mine? And in thinking about it, you very quickly come to see that, no, it isn't just a subjective judgment, just, I say, like me liking Baroque, you liking the Bauhaus. That isn't like me liking strawberries and you liking raspberries. There are so many things to be said. It's not just that we can say them, that we must say them. And this is implicit in the very practice of building. Wittgenstein gives a very nice little example of this in his lectures on aesthetics. You imagine a builder putting a door in a wall. Obviously, there are infinitely many ways of doing this, infinitely many heights, breadths, infinitely many details, the colour and so on. How will he think about it? Suppose he's talking to a companion who's looking at it from afar. What was the language they will use? Well, the language will be that of right and wrong. The companion will say, a bit higher, a bit to the left. Yes, that's right. This idea of the right and the wrong is there in the very enterprise. And he's not judging it in terms of its function or its utility. There are infinitely many things that will do the job just as well. He's justifying it in terms of the way it looks, how it is in itself. This is an example of reasoning about an end and not about a means. And this is a crucial thing which I think comes into our consciousness through the practice of art and the aesthetic, that there are such things in human life as ends and not means. One of them we had yesterday when Murray played us the Bach Cello Suite No. 2. That isn't valuable to us as a means. It's valuable to us intrinsically, and we sat in silence and resonated to it in the same way as his cello resonated to it, as the thing that was there and totally filled the moral space available. And that's what a real architect does when he's just doing those little details, like fitting a door into a wall. And getting things right means is an arduous discipline. It's why we evolve a vocabulary of forms. And you know very well, although you've never perhaps formulated it to yourself, that the mouldings on that door, they match the mouldings around it. That's the right thing to do with those mouldings. You may have worries about the cornice, whether it is exactly right for those Neo-Georgian doors. There are problems, but you know that whatever answer you come up with, somebody has thought about this, and if he's got it wrong, then you might blame him for it. And one sign of getting it wrong in architecture is that the building disappears in due course because nobody wants to keep it. This practice of reasoning about details conforms to what T.S. Eliot called the common pursuit of true judgment. We're not giving and taking reasons just for ourselves alone. It's a dialogue with others, because we're in building something, we're creating what is potentially a shared space. So a truly successful building is one that changes its use, as Santa Sophia in Constantinople changed its use from church to stables to barracks to mosque to museum, without any problems, because everybody wanted to keep it, and all the best buildings are like that. Now, of course, there are lots of conflicts between people about what is the right style, and styles change. But what is changing here is not something, just an arbitrary replacement of one thing by another. It's the development of this process of reasoning about things so that they conform with the form of life around them. Another example, and I'll end on this one because it's more important to me really these days, is the example of music. This too is part of the Lebenswelt. Philosophers can say a lot about music, and they haven't said as much as they should probably, but it very well illustrates the fact that our world can be understood in two completely different ways. A melody in music consists of a series of pitched sounds, as is obvious. And a physicist will say a lot about those sounds. You know, this one is vibrating at 340 hertz, and this is at 480 hertz, and so on. And he can talk about the temporal spacing of the sound, and that's a complete description of what goes on, say, when that melody is played. But it isn't a description of what you hear, because it doesn't mention, for one thing, that something begins in that sound. It doesn't mention the fact that it moves through a certain space. It doesn't mention all kinds of features that are absolutely natural for you to hear. And you know, a melody can just be moving, preoccupying you completely, even though there is no sound. I'll give you an example, because a very simple example that you all know. That's why my fingers. Anyway, as you hear, most of that consisted of silence, but it was moving all the time through that silence. But in the physical world, there wasn't anything going on in that silence, nothing that was contributing to the melody, and there was, you know, there was nothing that was moving either. Same with things like chords. You know, when you hear a chord, you hear a single thing. You don't hear all those notes. You can sometimes hear all those notes, and in modern music, atonal music, people sometimes describe, instead of using the word chord, they'll talk of a simultaneity, because these are sounds going on together. But most people would hear you know, that as one thing. That's just the triad. And chords have different qualities. They can. That's a much more transparent version of the same chord. And chords can be dense and heavy, you know, so you can't push things through them. Here's a famous example, which from the Rite of Spring, where there's no space left in where you can push anything into it. You know, those are all, you say those are all metaphors. They're not really simple metaphors. They are describing exactly what music is. Music occurs in a one-dimensional space in which there are forces and fields, and things are attracted to each other and repelled from each other. Things move and so on. And this imagined space demands a description, and this is one thing I think philosophers can do. You know, that just as in the case of architecture, what I was doing with architecture, I was giving you an a priori description of a field of relationship, a field of phenomena with which we are in relation. And the same can be done in music, giving this a priori description of a field of phenomena. And I think that's something that philosophy does, and if it's done properly, it opens that field to our understanding and helps to support the judgments that a critic might make, the emotions that we might feel. You know, if we have the great question, which everybody ought to have, you know, why does music matter? And if it does matter, which music should I really be cultivating an interest in? You know, that is a serious question. And it's an opaque question until you've done this kind of philosophical exploration of what the field of interest is. So, and we know, obviously from the example of dancing, that music is connected directly with the forms of human social life. And as Plato said, the forms of music and poetry cannot be changed without changing the basic laws of the state, which is a very frightening thing if it's true, because it means that an awful lot has changed other than just music in our lives. So my task as a philosopher, I've always thought of as, therefore, as reweaving the torn Lebenswelt, so as to offer again this kind of understanding of the world in spite of science, so to speak, which is the world in which we live, in which we find meanings. And it isn't just a conceptual exercise. There is a underlying therapeutic purpose, which is to show the way in which we can attach our ideas of community to these things like music and architecture, and find guidance through the world that we share. Whether it will bring you at last to God is another question. That is a theological question. But in my book, The Soul of the World, I try and say something about the way in which our interactions with each other in the eye-to-eye relation take us up to that one-sided boundary and inevitably give us the sense that someone is looking at us from the other side. But whether you can translate that into literal prose is another matter. That's it. Thank you.